Welcome, 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 welcome. It is such a treat and an honor to be with all of you today. And I get to introduce you to one of my favorite people on the planet. And I'm glad that you're here, Rosa. I see that you eventually found it. And I'm sending out reminders momentarily. What I'll just share is that Hāweatea is one of my favorite humans on the planet. And I first met her at an airport. I love meeting people's meeting stories. I first met her at an airport and at a Starbucks line. And I was in between flights. It was Maui Airport. And we struck up this conversation. And you know, it's a rare moments when you're in a place that's so transient where everyone's like on the go. And all of a sudden something happens where the world stops and the field of communion and connection is so strong that I couldn't leave the conversation to go catch my flight. And I missed my flights because I had fallen into the whale world of this amazing, beautiful woman. And I'm going to read you just a little bit of her bio. And pardon me while I set everything in motion over here. It's the end of we are nearly at the end of our third day of the Sacred Storytelling Summit, and it has been just an incredible time. I don't know how many of you guys have been with us on this journey for a while. You want to raise your hands, or how many of this is your how many of you have been there? And I always recommend, by the way, placing yourself on video. I know it's so compelling just to stay and listen, but it's your participation and your engagement enriches this experience for everybody. And so really, if you can place yourself on video, it's really quite lovely. And sorry, here we have one of our main people is in the other room, so it means that I'm playing three roles at the moment, which if you see me moving around all these different things, that's what's happening. But here we have this amazing woman. Hāweatea specializes in trauma, transition, and transformation. She is a psychotherapist, couples counselor, and rites of passage guide for 15 years, and Māori healing practitioner for 10 years. As a nature-based therapist and guide, these experiential forms of listening have been at the core of her work and within prisons, Indigenous community programs, veteran recovery and renewal retreats, family quests, and women in their heroine's journey. Her community bases are Hawaii, Australia, and oh gosh, I hope I pronounce this right, Aotearoa. Through Nature Knows, she trains facilitators in rites of passage, culturally relevant ceremony, nature-based therapy, and quests. I just want to say one more thing before I totally hand over the mic, which is, why would we have this kind of class at a school for sacred storytelling? And to me, it is about that storytelling, what makes storytelling sacred is, you know, and I've talked about this, and I'll send you the class in case you missed it, but it's the alchemy of when we're connected to earth and when we're connected to spirit, and that comes through this beautiful vessel of our being, and it comes to the resonance, the heartbeat of our voice, and then we're sharing that connection out into the world of stories that serve life. And so this piece of being connected to earth, it's actually one of the most core foundational principles you can have in a sacred storytelling school. And so that's why I get to, in this rites of nature work, it's so much about story, your personal story, and claiming your story. So it is just such a privilege to get to be with this amazing, beautiful being. And she's in a particularly extraordinarily ripe chapter. You know, like we all meet chapters at different moments of their own development and their own life, and we all have our own journey as teachers. And we're really lucky right now because we're really getting to be in a particularly new chapter and a ripe chapter. So I will now hand over the mic, and such a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you, Leah. I feel the coaxing of your voice like a cloak. I just wanted to ask, just before you mute, I keep getting notifications to admit people. Is there a way to just let them
We
Does it
do
have
that.
to? Okay.
I'll manage all that for you.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm beginning. Kia ora, everyone. Ko ai au, ko uruao te waka, ko arai te uru te waka, ko auraki te mauka, ko te mauna o wākea, te mauna, ko takurua ki runga te whetu, ko takurua ki raro te whanga, ko waikora pupu te puna waiora, ko te moana nui a kiwa, te ara moana, ko kaitahu, ko waitaha, ko kati mamoi, toku iwi, ko Hāweatea Holly Bryson aho. Just want to welcome you all. And, you know, we often open with this, you know, ko ai o, who am I? What waters am I? Where did you grow out of? What feeds you? And so just introducing myself by my places, the bay in Sydney that grew me up, my family from the South Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand, my home base in Hawaii Island, and the Pacific Triangle, those waters as my membrane. And also it's Māori Language Week. But I just want to greet you, all of you that are here, all of you that came yesterday, and also all that listens with you, you know, the bigger bodies that you're each a part of, that you're bringing in here today. And those places that we're so connected with that sometimes we don't even take note of it, you know, and that these places are part of your sensory body, you feel them, or you choose to. And that's something that I just want to invite us to contemplate today, the idea of listening as a choice. And so as we enter this wānanga together, wānanga is really a deep consultation into your own listening. And I know that we call these a masterclass, but I don't know what that is. So whatever it is your own. And so I just want to invite us to suspend the mind, suspend any theories, and just to enter a contemplation in this field that we're in together, to be able to feel that, even though we're with a screen, in placing these questions at the center. And so I invite you to hold with me, you know, how do we listen in a busy world of constant input, movement, and noise? How do we enter these conversations with the heart of life, where these stories reside, you know, where they breathe, where they shift, where they're not stationary, and also to be held or like really looked after inside that navigation. And so my intention is just to share some of the listening doorways that are really the grounding stones of Indigenous relationship, and, you know, referring to this indigeneity as really a collective unlearning that we're all in. So just to consider that we can't be in wānanga when we're multitasking. So, you know, often our body's doing a task and our mind is actually listening over there, and that deep listening really involves all our senses. And there's an invitation to attune to some of those 12 senses in this container we're in today. So, of course, you know, you can put your hands to work traditionally, you know, weaving, moving, making. And this is where our hands are really joining us, or our hands are with us. So just a distinction. And so just also a personal process. If you're a writer or a note taker, I just invite you to draw a line down the middle of your paper. And, you know, any cues you're hearing from me, it might be a little short note on the left, and the right is really what emerges in you. So even though we're a little less interactive today than we are in other settings, and obviously this begins by me speaking to it, that there's another layer of your listening that is making itself available. You know, any echoes, any sensations, those sort of interconnections that arise in you, that voice, that instinct, those senses that you hear behind my words. This is what you come for. And so I just invite this right side of the page. Yeah. And so I just want to, you know, I think the beginning of this is really acknowledging the difficulty of listening in this sort of competing attention in a world that demands like response and output. And that, you know, thus one of the most powerful things we can do is to first listen. And how hard that can be when we're like bombarded with external sensory input to actually locate our own voice, and not the mental response, but like the voice that cuts through, the voice that sort of clears the way. And so I often refer to 5 sort of anchors within the listener. And one of these is readiness. And readiness is very non-judgmental. There's no place to be. But readiness really refers to that the problem is not to find the answer, it's to face the answer. And, we can distract and procrastinate, at least I can, until the cows come home from my own listening. And so sometimes we have to give something up, in order to receive. And I know that I can, so part of this readiness is also that, I can hear the same story 5 times. I can receive the same advice 5 times. I can have the same sign enter 5 times. And then suddenly it's that the lady at the bus stop who says something really casually to me, where that lands. And so what is listening but a readiness? And so, part of this is also just honoring like the story that's coming through rather than the one we want to hear. But that this idea that when we're in overwhelm, often we have to give something up. And so again, just this consideration today of listening as a choice, and that's the layer of listening that we're talking about. That field of like pure information, of knowing, of patterning, of direct experience. And one of the things I love about the school of sacred storytelling is that, and Leah is that kind of dedication to listening to those stories, those renewal stories, those truth-telling stories. And that when we're in the stream of communication, that listening actually is really sustainable, whereas mental attention is not. So I just want to ask, how many of us have ever had a fantasy of listening, which is where, you just imagine you can just step through a listening doorway, you just receive what's needed, you step back into ordinary life, and, maybe that encounter is so penetrating, that it feels like hours, but it's maybe only been 20 minutes, or it feels like 30 minutes, but it's only been 3. So just a little wave of hands of how many people have had a fantasy of listening. Okay. And can you remember an experience where time just slowed down and like so much happened in the space of a moment? And one of the ones I hear the most that comes to mind is like, I love the hands now, is an accident, whether it's you or maybe your child was hurt. And for me, recently when I was hit by a car, it's like there's 10 seconds where I can re-enter that moment. And so much happened. It's like a chapter. I can like wander around that memory. And it's all the senses are switched into this open attention, right? And open attention is when we're just with the unknown and we're completely outside of predictive space. And every part of the mind accepts the unknown. And so there's this immediacy of like listening and responsiveness. There's no cognition. It's like where the sense of instinct lives. And, as we sort of recall an example, I want to invite us to have a more of a positive or a connected example. But as I'm here with Leah, and our story is always circled around whales, so just another example of drifting off the back of a boat from a rope, and this mama and her calf coming up and just letting go of that rope, and the boat sort of dissolving and sinking underneath the water, and having these 2 eyes come in which just held me, and feeling completely stilled by their sound. And this is something I was able to learn later, that they still sharks, with this sort of sonar vibration. And it felt like a lifetime. And in that, the receiving of that, it was like I changed, my story changed, but it was only one breath. And so as you sort of, I just want you to welcome right now any memory that comes, when maybe you were taken by surprise, or you stepped out of the known and that sort of mental control disappeared and you were just open in a belonging, maybe a flow state, or like a pure attentiveness. And just to give that like a title or a name. And trust, the memory, the first thoughts that come. And then I also just invite you to observe one physical sensation. And it's interesting about this because often when we return to these memories, we almost think of them as an out-of-body experience because the mind is suspended, right? But you were there. It's just the mind was so open. And so when we return into it, it's the sensation that takes us back in, because there's a tremendous amount of sensation that's taking place. All the senses are alive, communicating. And so to re-enter that by recalling a sense, letting the sensation just sort of carry you back in. And within that, if you ever want to, you can hold up a question and receive a response, which often arrives more as an understanding, right? More as an internal understanding. And it might come through any of the senses. And so this listening space, that some of these key features are this sort of acceptance of the unknown and this dropping or release of control of what we want to happen there. And also this contact, right? That there's actually a contact, a connection. There's a receiver that's broader than the I. And similarly to, this timelessness that we experience when we listen to a captivating story, where it sort of lights up all your internal pathways and it continues to play, that story that continues to play through you, and we can re-enter it later. Like if you've ever had a dream and when you wake up from that dream, there's a sensation left over that you can't shake, and it's just with you for that morning. So yeah, just acknowledging this sort of neurophysiology of having to give something up or drop something, the known or the control, and that this listening or this receiving, this knowing is really multisensory. Our stories are inherently multisensory, and our understandings are multisensory. So wānanga, na wāna atua, it also means the time, space, place of the gods, right? So if you're entering into a council, like a council of beings, and there's a kumu on Molokai, Kumu Pa'a Lawrence Aki, who often asks this question of like, who are you talking to? And, I love this question because it's such a foreign question. When I witness this, when we're in wānanga, right? So someone might, who are you talking to? Who are you asking to be in this listening with you? Who are you praying to? And sometimes people are like, oh, it's the universe, trying to find a name. And to continue to quote him, he'll say like, kolohe and kepalo do exist, which is, just acknowledging like the tricksters, right? The ones that play with us, that there's an intelligence and a consciousness in the universe with all kinds of intentions. And so this can be considered an essential question of specificity of listening, of intimacy, of like, do you know its name, that it's part of your relationship together, part of your intimacy. And so if I'm, if I want to consult with the winds, or I have strong winds in my head, or I'm angry, and so my breath, the winds in my lungs are different. If I want to talk to the wind, I'm talking to Tāwhiri Mātea. And so all our stories, traditional stories, you know, they're full of all these alive names of these elder beings that are, far older than you and I. And often I don't know these names, but if I want to connect with a type of wind from a heart that knows that that being has a name, that it's not my environment, it's not the weather, and we're getting to know one another. And so, dropping this idea that it's about knowledge, right? But that really it's about the intimacy or the relationship or the curiosity of that interchange. And it kind of reminds me of like the expression of, you know, if you want a child to listen to their heart, you teach them to listen to the littlest birds and the wind and the rain. And the child will tell you the name of that bird or what the rain wants. And, you know, it's not really up to us to decide if they made that up or if they heard it, because that child is obeying their first thought. And, you know, that reveals something about maybe about them or about the encounter or about the experience, right, of what's happening. But the child will also stay open to the name changing. Whereas as adults, we sort of just believe that we know and we stop listening, or we just think of what we know. And so, and again, the point is not in the name because that's just one sense, right? But all our senses can be in this kind of learning and in the encounter of who we're in conversation with, what we need to hear. And so, that these natural forces are just they're in the patterning with us. And so I think this also really brings up the question of like, how do we tell the difference between imagination and knowing, or between our worry and our thoughts and our real intuitive feeling? And, you know, sure, these are skills. It's part of like, obviously it's part of self-discovery and self-awareness, right? Because listening is a language. And, you know, what we're talking about is listening are the grounding stones of Indigenous knowledge banks. And so I just really want to talk about one of our earliest wounds, right? So when we were children and we were told about these guardians and these allies, right? If you can remember being taught about these guardians and allies that cared about you and that witnessed what you were up to and would bring a gift for you. And these guardians or allies, Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, were not just make-believe, right? But they were carried out with you in the ignorant dark. And while others pretended together. And I just feel there's such sadness here. Like, if you ever felt humiliation for having invested so much of your innocent faith in this, or disappointment, then I'm with you, because I remember in a game of hide and seek finding those eggs in a grocery bag under my parents' bed, and the pretense, watching them pretend the next day. And that this, you know, we had so many rabbits around, but that there wasn't this rabbit that in a particular season, like birthed, sculpted something out of chocolate. And my grief lasted days, you know, and then it was sort of like a rite of passage, because in coming of age into some kind of adult that now gets to tell that pretend story to my sisters, you know. And and in, you know, in the Māori world, or in the Hawaiian worldview, like, our stories about our guardians, our allies, these brothers and sisters in the sun and in the trees, are the grounding stones of how we learn to listen. And that is the age too. And you know, these are Tāwhiri Mātea, the wind, or Tutu Pele at the volcano, or seeing a shana here, no paka, the lovers in the flower, or hine marama, those faces that we can see almost every night in the moon, right? And her tides and her moods. And so they are conversing, gifting, emoting, watching, responding with us. And so I really experienced this as an early wound, you know, that in our ability to like open ourselves to the storied world that is speaking with us and is loving on us, responding to us, that whether that's seen or unseen, known or unknown. And so, yeah, just feeling the antidote or the remedy of this as, you know, the mechanism of listening that we're born with as children, to be able to hear or hold or not override your first thought. You know, the first thought that comes in without any internal censoring or any editing or overthinking. And with so many of these listening doorways, it's like as soon as we just become aware of them, they're there. And so just a lot of these are just kind of seeds that I feel is just part of this unlearning of being able to trust your impulse or your instinct, that first arrival, starting to notice it or starting to cherish it. And, you know, not denying that part of yourself. And even to suspend disbelief. You know, we look back on like, yeah, even talking about a rabbit that sculpts out of chocolate, like the suspension of disbelief is the part that actually opens up those listening possibilities and to be able to take the eyes of the child again. So our stories are so wonderful because they let these other aspects be able to speak, and the world is so much bigger than us and we need that. And so, yes, I want to talk about some of these senses today. And again, just, you know, I just am honoring the conversation that's happening in all of you. But I want to start with like the story of having a conversation, these levels of a conversation as a way of kind of leading into that. And so, you know, when we have a conversation, the idea that there are different levels of a conversation and that all are necessary, none's better than the other, but that they're doorways when we're aware of them. So for example, a boy catches a fish, and maybe it's his first fish, and he holds it and he just says, "Sorry, fish," you know, and this is the level where we're talking to, right? And it's not really the first thought, we're just sort of releasing. And then the second one might be talking with, where when we're talking with, we actually have to reveal something about ourselves, right? So the boy's holding the fish and he just says, "Thank you." And when we're talking with, you know, with the natural world or with with a person, we're actually like unhindering, or we're finding understanding, right? There's this ability to get a lot of insight or movement in ourselves. And talking with can also be a prayer. It can, talking with the natural world can also be, you know, the question that you set down to await a response. And it's this sort of mirror between inside and outside, right? The two of you having a conversation. And this can be really powerful when working with stories that are coming through you, stories that are unfolding your own story, where we can turn specifically to one of these beings and engage it. And in this level of talking with, you're still you. So the third is like the deep encounter, right? Where you're almost sharing the same skin. And just for example, with my ex-partner, I would often I spent a lot of time watching the way he would fish. And as a Hawaiian, Tahitian, Filipino, you know, in his family, fishing was just a part of your arms. And so one day I asked him, you know, "Do you pray when you fish?" And it was to him like a quite a shocking, disconnected, random question, like that took him out of the moment. I assumed he was talking about, like a Mormon or a Christian prayer. But it answered my question, because if he doesn't pray, then I don't know what prayer is. Because what I witness is just this dissolving, right? Like just kind of into the coastline and standing on the shore, but all the senses being in the water. And on this inside of the field, there's also, in this level of conversation, there's really no will, right? So he might come back and say we need to move on. And so there's no him from which to pray. And that this third level of conversation is just such a natural state. So often we talk, or I hear us talking about this as like a higher state or a heightened state, but that it's just a very, very natural state. And in this deep encounter, there's a whole different level of truth that enters here. So we're outside our own kind of paradigms or wants, and that we're part of, a much bigger and maybe more honest story. And in this third layer, all our internal senses are very much involved. But yeah, and as we're here, talking about renewal stories, healing stories, truth telling, this is a place where that'll is just very available. And it's also a place where we could tell our stories from when we enter a different membrane, right, of which to speak from. And it's also the place where we can navigate our stories when we're open. Yeah. So all these levels are fascinating. For me, I've spent a lot of my time in the second encounter, which is like almost like pulling up to the waterfall, ready to have dinner. Sitting down to dinner, getting up my plate, asking for its attention. But just as soon as my awareness also goes to the encounter, which is sort of what we were talking about at the beginning, right? Where there is a letting go, and there's all these internal senses that are listening and telling. So I just want to check the chat for a second. Okay, cool. So of the so of these sort of 12 senses, we often think of like the first 5, right? The common ones, these external, well, we call them external: sight, smell, taste, hearing, feeling. And these are also how we tell our stories and also how we experience everything. This is also, for me, these senses are also sometimes where I get really bombarded, right? They can feel even loud or violent. And when that happens for me, I tend to contract and brace. And actually it gets, in my resisting that, it gets louder. It gets stronger. It becomes more overriding. And so what I found is that I have to actually accept its presence. It's the same with even right now, I'm in relationship to the train and the siren that's out here. And in accepting that, there's something that kind of gets bigger in me, expands in me, where I can actually hear more. I could at least hear my inner and these other senses again. But this is probably the health, right? And why we've learned to turn our senses off. Like if listening is a choice, we can turn towards it, we can turn away from it. The idea that there's health in that, but that also, what would it be like to be able to consciously do that with 12 rather than just be bracing around this 5? That's a question I walk with all the time. And so just in looking at these 5 senses for a moment with these layers of conversation. So the first one might be, right, me just talking to the weather. I like you today. This, the sun's out, right? The second one, the second level of talking with might be for me to step out into the wind in that example before, me to step out into the wind and actually let the wind take from me, pull from me, cleanse me, to have this sort of physical or emotional exchange where I'm in this conversation with the wind. And then the third would be this fluidity, right? Where I'm a part of you and you're a part of me. And the third immediately brings on the other senses as well. And so I'm going to go there, but just another part of these 5 main senses that we're oriented to, you know, these are all the senses that are communicating with us, like when we see something or when we hear something, you know, a sign or a symbol or a call to attention, a call to listening. And there's a meaning, right, behind that call, behind that draw to attention. And that often that's when the mind comes in and starts to play or create and kind of take over. And so again, this kind of dropping the known, dropping the expected in order to receive, where the actual conversation can come in with whatever part of life is like here, calling me to attention for the listening. And so sort of where we started with that piece again of how we have to let go of our meanings often to find the message that's actually coming through, and the readiness for that. So in terms of these sort of internal senses, you know, these are also just the idea that we don't have a dominant sense. I just want to put that in the center. You know, when we call ourselves a visual or an auditory person, a kinesthetic person, it's just what's developed. It's like part of your story. And that, but that all the senses are there. And there's something so beautiful about that to me, that there's these other people at the table that we just haven't had the time to pay attention to yet. And that often it's just a seed of awareness, you know. So when one of my elders, teacher Atarangi Muru, was talking about smell, right? This inner smell that we have. I had no reference for this. Then a moment the seed's there, it's like you start to notice what that is. And so that's sort of my intention for naming a couple of these right now, of that there's actually and similarly, when I was talking about those kepalo, those kolohe, you know, those tricksters that come in, like even when we're in the listening, that the discernment is within us in these inner senses, you know, that there's an actual smell that's like yes or no. Or there'll be a smell of, you know, especially in Māori healing, that's telling me to pause or to stop, you know, to not go there, or and that there's no right or wrong. It's just within that field of truth, of that pure information, where my will doesn't matter, right? My desire has to be put down. And so these sort of smells are very personal to you as you start to notice them. So for example, I always had the smell of like tobacco, and it was only one day when I was sitting behind this man in the row in front of me. He had a navy sweater, and I could smell the smell, but it wasn't my internal smell. It was coming from him. And I realized he had the same jumper and the same smell as my papa. And so, you know, the way that these associations come in is very personal, and we don't need to analyze them, but that there's a smell for something and a smell for something else. Similar, there'll be a taste, right? You know, a taste in your mouth when something's right, or when there's something to take care around. And in a lot of cultures, we talk about, you know, that ambrosia, that kind of nectar, that little sweet taste underneath your tongue. That's an internal kind of activation. Similarly with like internal sight, you know, the images you'll have when someone's talking. And these are, you know, also such a beautiful part of when we're actually just taking someone in and listening to their story, which is such a big part of the healing power of a story, right? Is also to be listening through these senses, because these inner senses are because they're part of this morphogenetic field. They're and when I'm referring to that, it's like this patterning or this truth telling, let's just say, that is outside of our own agency. And so when we're listening to someone in and offering mirroring, it's like to be able to receive. You're really receiving from them images, right? Themes, moments where something in their story changed, moments where they got really strong or where something touched them. And so we're tracking a voice, or there might be certain words that you hear that keep being repeated. And so, mirroring as a sort of story act of healing is like just to be able to hold up those things back to someone. And in this, we're not adding to or projecting anything. It's almost just like catching that story and holding it back up in this sort of moment of listening together. And so just I have some notes here to try to keep me on track, because I could talk about these things for too long. But in just bringing this into these like Indigenous legacies of storytelling, right, or story guardianship, that we have a place for our stories and the way that we're actually inside stories together, right? So we have these containers or these sort of ceremonies for stories where we don't actually need to protect each other from them. And that if you've ever had that experience of changing mid-story yourself, changing mid-listening, that we actually are in that changing shape. Or even, when we're sitting in a circle together, that I'm going to share something different if I'm the third speaker or the eighth, because there's something that's taking place together. But just having this idea of not needing protection from them. And there's a big part of this in these old stories that are told. It's like, so often I've heard a story and there are parts of that story that I don't like. It's like, or I'll, this comes up in a lot of discussions, like, oh, that part's a bit dark, or that's a bit old-fashioned, or I don't really, that bit makes me uncomfortable, or whatever it is. And just that we actually don't get to cut those parts out. And this is again like one of the parts of those anchors of like readiness, right, or resonance. My koro, who's a teacher of mine, he'll tell me a story and there'll be this unconscious part of my mind that will go, and I know better than this, but it happens all the time anyway, where it goes, oh, he's forgotten that he's told me this story before. And then I catch myself, and I have to, because when we recognize a story, we often sort of move away from it like we know it. And then I have to bring myself back, right? And so, the other day he told me a story, and it must have been for the 8th time. And it was a completely different story again to the one it was the last few times, because of the resonance of what I'm listening to. And these are the anchors in the listener. Like sometimes we actually are holding an unconscious question that we're listening for, and we are waiting for a time in the conversation to even be able to bring it up, right? So yeah, this idea of just hearing a story multiple times, and that there'll be parts of a story that we don't understand because they're not ready yet, or we're not in that experience yet. And so this idea of these stories as, that we don't have to understand them, but to keep them, to be keepers of them. What does that even mean? And similarly, it's like in these kind of legacies, and I'm using that word because it really implies how these stories carry us, and we circle through them, right? And so, to be given a story is like, you could be told that story 50 times. You could be asked to tell that story multiple times. And in my experience of this, the person who's taught me that story will just kind of close their eye. They'll ask me to share it and they'll just kind of close their eyes and listen. And there's no feedback. But I'll know that I haven't gotten it yet, because they'll continue to tell it and continue to ask me to tell it. And what that shows me is that there are layers and pieces in that story that I don't have an experience with yet, or that I haven't seen or noticed or lived through. And so there's just something about the fact that we're actually held in the story rather than the story is just, contained within us. But I do love that idea that we don't need to fully understand. A great story won't be, because it's still happening. It's still taking place. And yeah, so kind of in pulling this together, one of our word for listening is rongo, right? And rongo is really all our senses except for sight. So to hear, to smell, to taste, to feel. And it's also our word for healing, for medicine, right? And so rongo, that part is the kind of reverberation, and ro is like takes us in within the self, right, into the origins, into the darkness, where there's just much to hear. And so whakarongo, the act of listening, right, really implies it's like the key to all healing. And I just love that as a contemplation for myself. What could that mean? What does that mean? And also whakarongo, the act of listening, wha is for, and so it's got these four sides, these four faces to it, right? So it's not just me sitting here alone listening. So often we think of listen, it's like there's I, but that listening has these dimensions that are calling us into that. So just listening to all your faces for a moment. So there was one more thing that I said I would name, and Leah asked me, "What are your points? How are you gonna anchor us?" Let me just check this. Okay. And that's relationship. So what a home anchor, home front is our relationship. So we're talking about the natural world, we're talking about the darkness, talking about, finding one's way and navigating the stories, but the home front of relationship. And often I sit with couples in counseling or counsel, and the practice of listening is like listening to what's unspoken as much as is spoken. And we all do this. So we're often actually attuning to what the other person's not saying, which is either listening to what we want to hear, which is the desire, the need, or the urge, or it can be the pain body that's like attuned to a painful kind of subtext that, we're feeling that the other person is saying. And so, this subtext of just hearing something different to what's spoken, of actually being attuned to what's underneath. And so what we can do is right beneath that is this layer of deeper subtext. I kind of call it telepathic subtext. I'm open if anyone has a better term for that, of listening to the field. And it's similar to, what we've been talking about, like even in the first exercise of having to let go of control of what we expect or a particular direction. And obviously it involves the anchors like readiness. But it's sort of like taking a step back and actually seeing that polymorphic field. And that word polymorphic actually comes out of like family constellations. If anyone's ever experienced that, where a person can step into the field of another person that they've never met, know nothing about, and are tuned into that, to this subtext or to these senses of what they feel like saying, or what's actually happening internally. That's how natural it is, that this happens without any kind of training, right? Just by opening to that. And so it's similar to kind of like a wide angle vision. If you've ever softened your gaze and stepped back and actually seen like what's the actual feeling, what's the actual, what's actually happening here. And so nature is obviously a good opening to practice this with. But I really love the question of like practically like what conversation needs to be heard. And that we can do this in tuning into this deeper subtext with our partner, with a family member, with someone who's passed. And it's not the kind of, the compassion that we love to do, where we make up a story about why they're doing what they're doing. But it's just that, like, coming back to that first story, the surprise and the letting go of what actually you first thought, feel, see, sense, and the curiosity of that. And so also when we're, for anyone here who's a writer, right, that we can attune to this morphic field with with a character too, where you actually allow a character to kind of take on a life which might even surprise you. Similarly to how we can attune to animals, to life, to death, to the land, to the body, and that there's actually that life force that starts to be in that encounter with us. And one of the key little features for me is that as soon as that happens, I'm immediately, this receiving for me is like an immediate learning. It's like, that's the part of me that knows that I'm not directing it. So some of these sort of closing thoughts here about, turning to our natural world, turning to the darkness, where the silence is aware, maybe feeling the wind at the tips of the trees rather than just here on my body, and maybe answering the words in my chest and feeling what it's like to say it and continuing to listen. But that, in this stream of consciousness, listening is sustainable, and that it's the mental attention that is not. I just want to, I'm really looking forward to anyone who comes into the month-long with me so that I can be in the exchange together. So I'm just appreciating your faces and like kind of feeling you. But I always look forward to that. The bouncing. It's a question here. What is that state called? Feel free to let me know what you mean by that question. The morphogenetic field? No? Okay. Leah, can I?
Yeah, sorry, yes, that was it. What's that called? That field?
The morphogenetic.
Morphogenic?
Yeah.
Can you spell that?
Right here. Or polymorphic.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Thank you for that. Just gorgeous session. Are you complete? I heard you say my name.
Yes, it's so hard for me to not hear. Yeah, yes, I am complete.
Okay. What a beautiful class. You know, I think one of the things that I really appreciate from these, you know, especially from this particular Indigenous perspective, is like it really opens up when you talked about smell and just invited in like smelling from that deeper place. You were right. The mere suggestion of paying attention all of a sudden brought my awareness to scent that I can smell right here in this room that I wasn't even aware of. You know, and this kind of tending to the details and way of being in the same place, you know, and the way sorry, I got distracted. I started looking at text. I can't read and speak at the same time. I don't know why we try. But I just appreciate opening all these doorways and other ways of being in relationship to life, to our senses, to our experiences, and to this deep, deep listening. And just thank you for all of you for being here and for being part of the Sacred Storytelling Summit and being part of this greater conversation of what does it mean to really grab the reins of what it means to be a conscious creator in these times, and what's required, like what's truly required. So I hope that this class just like served you in every which wonderful way. We have a 4-week or 6 weeks class coming up? I'm gonna 4-week class coming up that begins right around the corner, September 19th. You lucky ducks. You have 4 delicious weeks to dive in. And I know that normally in your classes, a lot of classes will be more interactive. You'll get to more things. This is a real class to really kind of drop you into the resonance of Hāweatea and to really start to feel the opportunity and the invitation to steep in this way of being, and to be able to do that, right? So rich. What a treasure, Kathy's saying. Yeah, I agree. Profound transmissions, open doorways. Yes, deep gratitude to be in the space together, says Terry. You have such beautiful energy, says Ruthie. Marianne is saying, learning about the stream of consciousness being sustainable and mental attention is not. That was so powerful. Thank you. I love that you guys are just anchoring all this stuff. And doesn't it make a difference when you get to start to hear? And then when you start to hear what other people said, you're like, or at least I'm like, oh, right. That happened for me too. Thank you for represencing it for me. I'm seeing more gratitude from Ashana. Such a gorgeous perspective on listening. Thank you, says Chelsea. Elaine is saying amazing. Tracy Lee is saying you need rest. I don't know who she's saying that to you.
Everyone.
everyone. Mahalo nui, says Terry. Appreciation for your deep ancestral knowing that you share. There's more. It's just like dripping in over here. I think I could say for another hour reading all the comments, but I'm going to drop this link in once again. So if you want to study with this beautiful being, with this,
we're going to play. So I'm seeing some of the other questions here, but actually be able to play with those senses, with mirroring, with actual listening experientials with yourself, and bringing that to the circle. So if you want to play, you can join me next week.
Yeah. All right. Well then, good beings. I wish you all the best for this evening. Tomorrow we have a whole nother day. It's kind of amazing. And it's a big day. It's not just like any day. It's a big day, which I don't know what that means because they've all felt pretty big. But tomorrow we're starting the morning with a story, with a storyteller. Serena Andrea will be doing the Sacred Enchantment, the story of Cerridwen, the White Witch of Wales. She'll be telling a story and also talking about how to catch a story. And then Naima is going to be with us, Naima Lightseed, and she'll be doing a piece on playing with the power of words. And it's an interesting follow-up because we're also talking about the colonization of language and how do we be aware of that. It's a beautiful class, and she is a muse of all muse. At 3 p.m., there's a panel which features Sophie Strand and Ian, gosh, I'm not giving anybody's names because they're not right in front of me, but it's reviving the imaginal axis, mythopoetics for a modern crisis. I have no idea what they're going to talk about, but I think it's going to be beautiful and woven with poetry. The classes go on. There's another class from another Australian that some of you might know, Jackie Bushell. She'll be teaching a beautiful class called Wilder Language of Belonging, Earth Stories of Eco-Mythology. And then tomorrow night, we have a very special evening where we will be doing an open mic, and it's our story salon. So if you have stories that have been provoked and pushed and prodded over this last few days, you're going to have an opportunity to share them in community. So that is where we are. And all of those links to attend, obviously, you know where to find them. They're in your email. Maybe if they're not right on top, I can guarantee they're in your promotions. And wishing you all the best. I invite you. Is there anything else that wants to be said before we take ourselves off Zoom? And
thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Invite you all to take yourselves
Good
off
night.
mute and maybe sing a little good night to each other. It feels like it's time to do a lullaby.
Thank you so much.
And thank you.
Good night. Sweet dreams. It's early in the day for Hāweatea. Good morning.